How to Pay for the Green New Deal by Yeva Nersisyan and Randall Wray. Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. The AAF estimates that, quote, to transition to a power sector that has net zero emissions of greenhouse gases in 10 years would require capital investment of $5.4 trillion by 2029, end quote. Holtz-Aiken et al. 2019. For states without nuclear moratoriums, the renewable energy mix would be 50% nuclear, 50% wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, and battery storage. For states with moratoriums, it would be 100% wind, solar, and storage. Adding another $200 billion per year, a midpoint estimate for a net zero emissions transportation system, and a $290 billion midpoint estimate per year for greening the housing stock, we would need $1.03 trillion or 5.3% of 2017 GDP annually. Footnote 11. Their estimates over 10 years range from $1.3 trillion to $2.7 trillion for the net zero emissions transportation system, and $1.6 trillion to $4.2 trillion for guaranteed green housing. We use midpoint estimates for both. End footnote. Footnote 12. Note that in our calculations of annual costs, we do not account for inflation. What matters is resource use, not nominal cost. Since we are reducing costs to percent of GDP, we presume that annual spending on components of the Green New Deal rise in price on a pace with growth of nominal GDP. We also assume the resource use is linear, although it is likely that some projects will have greater upfront costs while other projects will be phased in later, after new infrastructure is in place. End footnote. Milton Ezrati, writing for Forbes, offers his own estimates for the various components of the Green New Deal, citing different sources, Ezrati 2019. Here, we only use his estimates for greening projects. Based on estimates by physicist Christopher Clark, the cost of expanding renewable energy to 100% would be $2 trillion over 10 years. The smart power grid would cost an additional $400 billion over 10 years, estimate from the Electric Power Institute. Footnote 13. Ezrati also includes very high estimates for greenhouse gas abatement, although it is not clear what his sources are and whether the numbers are global or for the U.S. only. Given the lack of clarity, we are not including this in our further estimations. End footnote. Upgrading and retrofitting buildings would cost between $2.5 trillion and $3.9 trillion, $3.2 trillion midpoint estimate, over 10 years. The total cost of greening projects comes to $5.6 trillion over 10 years, $560 billion per year, or 2.87% of 2017 GDP. A 2014 report from the Center for American Progress, CAP, and the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI, offers more modest reductions to greenhouse gas emissions, reducing them by about 40% over 20 years at a cost of about $200 billion in annual capital expenditures. Poland et al. 2014. Of that $200 billion, $110 billion would be invested in low or zero emissions renewable energy generation, while the remaining $90 billion would go toward improving energy efficiency of residential and industrial buildings and transportation. Their estimates for 20 years are as follows: $1.75 trillion investments into energy efficiency, including improving transportation efficiency, and $2.1 trillion investments into renewable energy. An additional $210 billion over 20 years can be invested in increasing public bus ridership, at 75 cents per ride. Our numbers below are based on shortening the timeline from 20 to 10 years and scaling it to 100% greenhouse gas reductions instead of 40%. Costs of greater reduction would not be perfectly linear, but this could be an approximate estimate. The increased public bus ridership numbers are not scaled, only shortened to 10 years. This brings our estimate of the total to $1,021 billion per year. While the CAP and Perry plan relies largely on biofuels to transition to renewables, the Jacobson plan by Mark Jacobson of Stanford is for 100% wind, water, sun, WWS. Jacobson et al. 2017. According to Jacobson, his plan would cost between $10 trillion and $15 trillion, Cassidy 2019, or 5.13% to 7.7% of 2017 GDP per year if implemented over 10 years. Midpoint estimate $12.5 trillion over 10 years, $1.25 trillion per year, or 6.41% of 2017 GDP. Jeffrey Heel of the Columbia Business School estimates that, quote, the U.S. economy could reduce carbon emissions by 80% from 2005 levels within 3 decades, end quote, through capital investments of between $3.3 trillion and $6 trillion, Heel 2017. Scaling this to 100%, again keeping in mind that this is a ballpark number, would take it to $4.1 trillion to $7.5 trillion. If implemented within 10 years instead of 3 decades, this could cost $410 to $750 billion per year, or 2.1% to 3.84% of 2017 GDP. Midpoint estimate $580 billion, or 2.97% of 2017 GDP. We should keep in mind that any longer-term estimates of transition to renewable energy may be misleading because of the rapid decline of the cost of renewables. While the costs of producing coal and nuclear have gone up by 9% and 23% respectively, the costs of solar, photovoltaic, and wind have decreased 88% and 69% respectively. In the last decade, Mahajan, 2018. According to a study by Energy Innovation, in 2018, renewable energy from local wind or solar was cheaper to produce than 74% of the coal fleet of the nation, Hill 2019. Without subsidies, already almost half of all coal projects would lose money, Carbon Tracker Initiative 2018. This number is projected to increase to almost 100% by 2025. If we can assume that falling costs in the case of renewables and rising costs in the case of non-renewables reflect rising efficiency of use of resources, so that it takes fewer resources to produce the same amount of energy, then resources required for the Green New Deal will fall over time. The table below Table 2 summarizes the costs of greening the economy, using averages whenever there is a range of estimates. An average of all the estimates is $888 billion annually, or 4.55% of GDP, and the average of these 3 costliest proposals is $1.1 trillion annually, or 5.6% of GDP, which is what we use in our estimates going forward. To transition to a zero emission system, however, we would stop all investment in the non-renewable sector and gradually dismantle existing non-renewable capacities. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, private investment in mining exploration shafts and wells was $140.9 billion in 2018, or about 0.7% of 2017 GDP, BEA 2019. We estimate that about 90% of that, or $127 billion, 0.65% of GDP, is investment in petroleum and natural gas. Footnote 14. While Table 5.3.5, BEA 2019, does not provide a further breakdown between petroleum and natural gas and other mining, Table 5.4.5, Private Fixed Investment in Structures by Type, does. According to that table, oil and natural gas investment comprised about 93% of total investment in structures, while investment in other mining was less than 7%. We are using a 90-10 breakdown in our estimates. End footnote. To get the net cost of greening, we would then need to subtract the sum of our current spending on non-renewables from our estimates below. Further, since we are already investing in renewables, that cost may need to be subtracted as well. However, since it is not clear whether the proposals below are estimating net or total costs of greening, we will err on the side of caution and will not subtract current renewable investment.